The room went silent. Cameras froze. And then, Judge Edward Chen leaned forward with just one line that left Pam Bondi speechless. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. Viewers watching at home felt their stomachs tighten. Reporters in the room exchanged wide-eyed glances. No one could quite believe what had just happened. Pam Bondi had been relentless, launching into her tirade with the confidence of someone who thought she owned the stage. She leaned into the microphone, her voice sharp, clipped, almost sneering. She threw out accusations, interruptions, and smirking dismissals as if they were confetti. It was theater, loud, brash, designed to overwhelm. She thought her dominance was unquestionable. Judge Edward Chen, however, was unmoved. His face remained calm, his posture steady, his eyes fixed, not on the cameras, not on the audience, but squarely on Bondi. He had listened quietly, letting her words echo and bounce against the walls of the chamber. Every insult, every interruption, every arrogant jab piled up like tinder around a fire. And yet he remained perfectly still. The silence after her final outburst was deafening. Even Bondi, for all her bravado, seemed to sense she had pushed too far. But it was too late. The trap was already set. Chen leaned forward, his voice measured, quiet, almost understated. But in its restraint, there was a weight that crushed every ounce of Bondi's bluster. One sentence. One carefully chosen line. It sliced through the air with surgical precision. The crowd gasped. Bondi blinked, her lips parting, her comeback collapsing before it could even form. The entire energy of the room shifted in an instant. Her dominance had evaporated, her showmanship shattered. What Judge Chen said that day would not stay within those walls. It would ricochet through television clips, flood across social media, and land in conversations at dinner tables across the country. His words became a dividing line, a moment when arrogance was forced to confront dignity, and lost. But the line he delivered would echo across America, setting off a chain reaction no one saw coming. And the truth is, Bondi never expected it. Because while she had been preparing her next attack, Chen had been preparing history. And this was only the beginning. It wasn't just a courtroom moment. It wasn't just another talking head exchange on TV. This was live, unfiltered, and carried on every major network. Millions of Americans sat in their living rooms, on their phones, in coffee shops and airports, watching in real time as the confrontation unfolded. Every breath, every pause, every glare was magnified by the camera lens. Pam Bondi thrived in that kind of spotlight. She leaned into it, projecting herself as the unwavering warrior of partisan righteousness. Her voice rose, not just to make a point, but to dominate the room, to command submission from her opponent. She wasn't there to discuss. She was there to perform. And in her performance, she embodied the kind of aggressive, divisive politics that had begun to poison the country, rhetoric sharpened into a blade, wielded not to illuminate the truth, but to cut down anyone who dared to stand in her way. And then there was Judge Edward Chen. No theatrics, no bluster, no need to shout above the noise. His presence in that moment was the antithesis of Bondi's. Where she was loud, he was silent. Where she threw fire, he absorbed it like stone. His dignity, quiet but immovable, reminded many watching of what justice was supposed to look like: steady, fair, unshaken. The contrast between them was impossible to ignore. Two Americas seemed to be colliding, one brash and performative, the other deliberate and principled. And because the cameras were rolling, there was no hiding, no retreat, no possibility of spin. This wasn't just another debate. This wasn't about clever zingers or viral moments, though a viral moment was about to arrive. It was about something deeper, something that millions of immigrants, workers, students, and ordinary citizens watching could feel in their bones. It was about the very definition of justice in America. Who speaks for it? Who embodies it? Who truly deserves the authority to define it? Pam Bondi kept talking. She grew sharper, more dismissive, tossing out accusations designed to rattle Chen. Her words struck the air like hammers. But each swing seemed to bounce back, because he refused to give her the satisfaction of flinching. And in that silence, the audience sensed something building. Twitter feeds lit up with comments like, "Why isn't he saying anything yet? What's he waiting for?" News anchors whispered into their microphones, "Chen hasn't responded, he's just sitting there, calm as ever." The anticipation was electric. The atmosphere in the room was charged, like the thick air before a thunderstorm. The audience wasn't just watching a debate anymore, they were watching a reckoning. They were watching arrogance stretch itself to its breaking point, unaware that quiet dignity was waiting with a hammer of its own. And the deeper Bondi dug, the more the crowd leaned in, waiting for the judge's response. To understand why this moment carried so much weight, you have to understand Pam Bondi. For years, she carved out a reputation as the sharp-tongued partisan warrior who never backed down from a fight. She relished the spotlight, thrived on confrontation, and cultivated an image as the prosecutor who could take down anyone who stood in her way. Her career was built not just on legal work, but on spectacle. Bondi's media appearances became almost as significant as her courtroom arguments. She learned early on that a well-timed smirk, a clipped soundbite, or a forceful interruption could carry farther than a carefully reasoned argument. She embraced the theater of politics, turning every appearance into a performance for an audience already primed to cheer her on. But with spectacle came contradictions that revealed the hollowness beneath the performance. She claimed to be a champion of law and order, yet found herself entangled in controversies over donations and conflicts of interest. She spoke of fairness and justice, but critics noted the cases she pursued often aligned less with principle and more with political convenience. Her public persona was ironclad confidence, but her record showed cracks that were harder to hide. Bondi's hubris, however, was her most defining trait. Every victory seemed to feed it. Every television booking, every headline, every viral clip added another layer of armor to the persona she projected: unstoppable, untouchable, unbeatable. When she walked into a confrontation, she believed the outcome was predetermined, that her sheer force of personality would bulldoze through reason, silence opposition, and secure her dominance. That was the energy she carried into the room with Judge Edward Chen. She didn't just expect to win, she expected to humiliate him, to frame him as weak, indecisive, or out of touch. In her mind, this was a stage designed for her performance, another opportunity to showcase her combative style and remind her supporters why they cheered for her in the first place. What she didn't realize was that the very style that had carried her so far was about to collapse under its own weight. Because in this moment, against this opponent, spectacle alone wasn't enough. She thought she could bulldoze her way through. She had no idea what was waiting. Pam Bondi underestimated the power of quiet strength. She underestimated how deeply people hungered for something beyond arrogance and posturing. And most fatally, she underestimated Judge Edward Chen. Chen's story is nothing like hers. His path was not built on spectacle or stunts, but on years of quiet perseverance. Where Bondi saw cameras and crowds as validation, Chen saw them as noise, distractions from the pursuit of truth. While she armed herself with sound bites, he prepared with patience, dignity, and a history rooted in resilience. The stage that Bondi thought belonged to her was about to shift under her feet. And as America leaned in, waiting for Chen's response, she was unknowingly writing the first chapter of her own undoing. Because Judge Chen's story is nothing like hers. Before that line, before that moment that stunned the nation, there was a story Judge Edward Chen carried with him every time he stepped into a courtroom, every time he was called to serve. It was not a story of privilege or entitlement. It was a story rooted in struggle, sacrifice, and quiet perseverance. Chen was born the son of immigrants, parents who arrived in America with little more than determination. They faced the kind of hardships that too often go unspoken: language barriers that closed doors, jobs that offered long hours but little pay, and the unrelenting weight of knowing they were seen as outsiders in the country they now called home. For his family, dignity wasn't handed down, it had to be fought for every single day. Growing up, Edward Chen knew what it felt like to be underestimated. In classrooms where his name was mispronounced, on playgrounds where difference made him a target, he carried the sting of exclusion. He also carried the resilience his parents modeled, An unshakable belief that even when the world closes in, perseverance can carve a path forward. Those early experiences shaped him. They taught him that the loudest voices were not always the wisest, that arrogance often crumbled under the weight of patience, and that dignity was not something granted by others but something cultivated within. Where others saw obstacles, Chen's family taught him to see lessons. Where others might have grown bitter, he grew resolved. As he pursued a career in law, the barriers didn't vanish. They grew sharper. He was told, sometimes directly, sometimes through the heavy silence of closed doors, that people like him weren't meant to sit on the bench, weren't meant to wield authority in a system that had so often marginalized those who looked like him. At times he was passed over. At times he was dismissed. And yet he never lashed out. He never raised his voice to demand recognition. He kept moving forward brick by brick, case by case, building not just a career but a reputation for integrity so unshakable it became impossible to ignore. Colleagues described him as steady, thoughtful, unwilling to bend to pressure. He didn't chase cameras, didn't crave headlines. His victories were quieter but no less powerful, ensuring fairness in cases that never made front-page news, treating even the most marginalized litigants with respect, embodying the principle that justice must be blind to prejudice but alive to humanity. Over time, his work spoke louder than any speech. Communities that had once felt invisible found in him a figure who represented them, not because he waved a flag for attention, but because he quietly lived the values they longed to see in positions of power. And though Chen would never boast about it, his journey inspired countless young immigrants and children of immigrants who saw in him a living answer to the question, "Do we belong here?" Yes, his life said. Yes, you belong. But even for someone as steady as Chen, the scars of discrimination never truly vanish. They remain, not as open wounds, but as reminders. Every slight he endured, every time his legitimacy was questioned, every time his heritage was used as a weapon against him, those moments did not weaken him. They prepared him. They became the forge in which his patience, his dignity, and his resolve were sharpened. And so when he sat across from Pam Bondi, listening to her barrage of attacks, the silence that radiated from him was not emptiness. It was the silence of decades lived on the margins, the silence of someone who had been underestimated his entire life and had learned to turn that underestimation into strength. Every slight, every obstacle, had prepared him for this moment. He wasn't just hearing her words. He was hearing echoes of every classroom where he was overlooked, every courtroom where he was doubted, every whispered comment that said people like him didn't belong. And unlike Bondi, who thrived on spectacle, Chen had no need to perform. He had only to be who he had always been, steady, dignified, unflinching. So when Bondi launched her attack, Chen didn't just hear her words. He heard decades of history, and he was ready. The exchange began with an almost predictable rhythm. Pam Bondi, brimming with confidence, leaned forward and launched into her attacks with the kind of speed and volume that suggested she wasn't interested in dialogue, only domination. She jabbed her finger at the desk, raised her eyebrows as if mocking the very idea that Chen's perspective could hold weight, and punctuated her sentences with smirks designed to signal superiority. She interrupted before questions were finished. She rolled her eyes when Chen's name was mentioned. Every gesture screamed dismissiveness, as though she were swatting away a nuisance rather than facing a federal judge whose career embodied dignity. Chen, by contrast, sat steady. His hands folded, his expression unreadable, his eyes calm but unwavering. He let her finish each barb without so much as a twitch. The silence wasn't weakness, it was fuel, and the longer it stretched, the more it unnerved those watching. Bondi grew louder. She began speaking over the moderator, speaking over Chen, speaking over the natural rhythm of the room. Her voice cut like a buzzsaw, determined to leave no space for anything but her own performance. But the more she pressed, the more the audience began to shift. What at first looked like dominance started to resemble desperation. Viewers at home could feel it. The tension crawling through the screen was unbearable. They could sense something was coming, that Chen's stillness wasn't passivity but preparation. On Twitter, posts popped up in real time. "Why isn't Chen saying anything yet? He's holding back. In living rooms across the country, people leaned forward, caught between frustration and anticipation. Inside the room, the energy thickened. Bondi's gestures grew sharper, her tone harsher. She laughed derisively after her own lines, filling the air with a hollow confidence. But Chen remained unmoved, and in that unshakable composure, he began to shift the balance without saying a word. The silence was no longer passive, it was active, like the tightening of a bowstring. Each arrogant dismissal from Bondi pulled it further back, and everyone watching knew the release would be powerful. The moderator tried to restore order, but Bondi barreled past. "He knows he can't answer. He knows he doesn't have a defense," she sneered, throwing her hands in the air as if victory had already been secured. But the audience wasn't convinced. The cameras caught subtle reactions, a furrowed brow in the front row, a reporter scribbling furiously, a spectator whispering to a neighbor. The mood had shifted. Bondi wasn't landing blows, she was overreaching. And still, Chen waited. Every second of his silence magnified the anticipation. It was no longer a question of if he would speak, but when. And when he finally did, it would not be wasted on shouting matches or petty retorts. It would be deliberate, devastating, unforgettable. The moment stretched thin, ready to snap. The buzz in the room was palpable, the collective inhale of an audience sensing history about to unfold. And then, Chen finally spoke. For what felt like an eternity, Judge Edward Chen sat in silence. The room buzzed with tension, every camera lens locked on him, every microphone straining for the first syllable to drop from his lips. Pam Bondi was still smirking, her body language practically screaming victory. She had been relentless, steamrolling through her monologue, cutting off questions, throwing in dismissive laughter as though the entire proceeding existed solely for her performance. And then, in a movement so subtle it almost went unnoticed, Chen leaned forward. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't sudden. It was quiet, deliberate, and terrifyingly calm. He set his hands on the desk, adjusted his glasses, and fixed his gaze on Bondi with the kind of focus that strips away all pretense. "Ms. Bondi," he began, his voice steady, low, and controlled. The room froze. "You confuse volume with virtue." The words landed like a hammer on glass. Shards of arrogance shattered instantly. Gasps rippled across the room. Reporters dropped their pens mid-scribble. The moderator blinked in disbelief. And for the first time that night, Pam Bondi's smirk faltered. It wasn't just what Chen said, it was how he said it. The line was sharp, surgical, delivered without anger, without flourish. No shouting, no theatrics. Just cold, undeniable truth, spoken with the kind of moral authority that silence had been saving up for this very moment. Bondi's eyes widened. She tried to laugh, to brush it off, but her voice caught in her throat. The cameras caught it all, the awkward blink, the tightening of her jaw, the way her shoulders stiffened as if she could physically resist the collapse of her performance. The crowd erupted, not in applause, because the setting didn't allow it, but in the kind of stifled reactions that were even more powerful. A low murmur spread, reporters whispering to one another, spectators exchanging wide-eyed glances, and then the barely audible but unmistakable sound of someone in the gallery whispering, "Wow!" Chen didn't move. He didn't follow it up with another jab. He didn't need to. The silence after his line was louder than anything Bondi had shouted all night. The cameras cut quickly, one feed zooming in on Bondi's face, capturing the flicker of disbelief, another cutting to Chen, whose calm expression hadn't changed. To anyone watching at home, the contrast was undeniable. On one side, a figure of composure and control. On the other, a performer suddenly robbed of her stage. Twitter lit up within seconds. Hashtags began trending almost immediately. Hashtag volume versus virtue. Hashtag Chen drops the line. Hashtag Bondi shutdown. Memes appeared faster than news outlets could keep up. Screenshots of Bondi's face in the moment after Chen's words circulated, paired with captions like, "When you realize the quiet kid just ended your career." On television, anchors struggled to hide their astonishment. One commentator whispered, "That might be the line of the year," while another added, You could feel the energy flip the second he spoke. Pam Bondi scrambled. She tried to regain footing, to jump back into the attack. She cleared her throat, forced a smile, leaned into her microphone as though she still controlled the room. But her words betrayed her. The crisp confidence was gone, replaced by stumbling phrases, awkward pauses, and a laugh that rang hollow. She gestured wildly, as though movement could fill the void her argument had left behind. She repeated the same points, louder this time, but louder no longer carried weight. Every word she spoke seemed to bounce back, reflecting her own unraveling. Chen remained still. He didn't interrupt. He didn't gloat. He simply let her spiral, the dignity of his silence contrasting so sharply with her unraveling performance that the outcome was undeniable. In living rooms across the country, people who had been bracing themselves for another exhausting display of arrogance sat up straighter. They smiled. They replayed the clip again and again, savoring the moment when arrogance was punctured by truth. The balance of power had shifted in an instant. Bondi no longer looked like the unshakable fighter. She looked cornered, rattled, exposed. Chen, on the other hand, looked exactly as he had from the beginning, calm, steady, deliberate. But now, that stillness had a new weight. It had the weight of victory. Social media swelled with validation. "This is what we've been waiting for," one user tweeted. "A reminder that dignity wins." Another wrote, "He didn't need a speech. He needed one sentence." Clips were shared thousands, then millions of times, the line becoming a rallying cry not just for Chen but for everyone who had ever felt drowned out by arrogance. Bondi kept talking, but it didn't matter. Every attempt to claw back control only highlighted how much she had lost. She was no longer steering the exchange, she was reacting, scrambling, stumbling. The spectacle she relied on had turned against her. And Judge Edward Chen? He sat quietly, letting the moment breathe. He didn't need to say another word. He had already said the only one that mattered. But the real impact of that line wouldn't be felt until the morning after. By dawn the next morning, Judge Chen's one-line takedown had transformed from a single exchange on live television into a national event. The clip replayed endlessly on every major news outlet. Morning shows opened with it, cable news panels dissected it frame by frame, and late-night comedians worked it into their monologues before audiences still buzzing from the moment. But the true explosion wasn't on television, it was online. Within minutes of the broadcast, Twitter had turned into a frenzy. Hashtags like #volume versus virtue, #ChenMicDrop, and #Bondi shutdown rocketed to the top of trending lists. The clip was looped, slowed down, captioned, and remixed into countless variations. One viral edit showed Bondi mid-smirk, immediately cut with Chen's line, followed by a booming sound effect and the words, "Game over." Memes spread like wildfire. A still of Bondi's stunned expression became a canvas for captions. "When you realize the quiet one was listening the whole time." Or, "Volume is temporary. Virtue is permanent." TikTok creators added dramatic music overlays, turning the moment into short cinematic skits that drew millions of views overnight. Celebrities weighed in too. An actor tweeted, "Judge Chen just gave us the line of the decade." A popular musician posted on Instagram, "That wasn't just a clapback. That was a history lesson in patience." Even athletes chimed in, posting the clip with captions like, "This is why you don't underestimate the quiet ones." Politicians quickly joined the chorus. Progressive leaders hailed Chen's calm dignity, calling his words a reminder of what true justice sounds like. Even some conservatives, wary of Bondi's increasingly theatrical reputation, admitted privately that she had overplayed her hand. Editorials framed it as a cultural turning point, the moment when arrogance and volume finally met their match in composure and substance. It wasn't just about Chen or Bondi anymore. The story had grown bigger than both of them. It became a referendum on the culture of noise, spectacle, and empty bravado that had seeped into public life. For millions of people, immigrants, children of immigrants, those who had been silenced, overlooked, or underestimated, it was vindication. Chen's line became their line, a piece of armor they could carry into their own struggles. College students printed the quote on posters. Community organizers used it as a rallying cry. Commentators replayed it as an emblem of a wider truth, that dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard. Bondi, meanwhile, found herself at the center of a storm she couldn't control. She attempted damage control, issuing statements that doubled down on her rhetoric, but each attempt only amplified the moment she had lost. Every response she gave was met with replies quoting Chen's devastating line back at her. She was no longer the star of her own performance, she was the punchline. And for Judge Chen, the response was staggering. His inbox flooded with messages from young lawyers, activists, and ordinary citizens thanking him for reminding them of something they feared was slipping away, the idea that calm truth can still cut through arrogance. He hadn't set out to become a viral sensation, but in his restraint, he had ignited a movement of validation and pride. Because this wasn't just about a courtroom or a television segment. It was about the very question of what kind of voice America chooses to listen to. Do we reward the loudest, most arrogant performer, or do we recognize the quiet strength that upholds dignity? The shockwaves didn't stop with memes and trending hashtags. They spilled into dinner table conversations, classrooms, churches, workplaces. People quoted Chen's words in debates with friends, in comments under political posts, in speeches at rallies. It was no longer just his line. It had become our line. And in the middle of the chaos, one truth stood tall. In the days that followed, Judge Edward Chen was asked again and again about the moment that had gone viral. Reporters wanted him to revel in it, to lean into the fame, to deliver more sound bites for the cameras. But in every interview, in every response, he redirected the spotlight. It was never about him, he insisted. It was about principle. He explained, in his measured tone, that justice isn't supposed to be a performance. It isn't supposed to reward the loudest or the brashest, but to reflect fairness, integrity, and dignity. One line doesn't matter if it's just about me, he said quietly in one exchange. It matters because it reminds us that the way we argue, the way we disagree, reflects the kind of society we want to be. The lesson resonated because it was bigger than Bondi, bigger than Chen, bigger even than that one broadcast. It spoke to a growing exhaustion with the culture of spectacle, where politics had become shouting matches, where dignity was drowned out by arrogance, where truth was buried beneath noise. Chen's moment of restraint, followed by his single decisive line, reminded people that power doesn't have to mean bluster. It was a message that reached especially deep into immigrant and marginalized communities. For those who had been told they were too quiet, too different, too unimportant to be heard, Chen's composure was a validation of their own resilience. It was proof that strength can take many forms, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the raised fist or the shouted insult, but the unflinching voice of principle. Because in America, the loudest voice doesn't always win. Sometimes it's the calmest. That idea echoed through classrooms where teachers used the clip to show students the difference between debate and disrespect. It traveled into workplaces where employees whispered, "Volume isn't virtue," during tense meetings. It appeared in sermons, in community gatherings, in marches where people carried the line on signs. What Chen had given them was more than a viral moment. It was a moral compass. The emotional crescendo of the story wasn't the takedown itself, but the lesson it revealed: arrogance will always collapse under the weight of dignity. Showmanship may grab the camera, but truth holds the heart. And while noise may dominate the moment, it is integrity that endures across time. Chen's line became a reminder that America is at its best when it chooses respect over ridicule, resilience over arrogance, justice over spectacle. And it gave people a language for their own battles, not just in politics, but in everyday life. Because every time someone dismisses you, talks over you, mocks your difference, or tries to erase your dignity, you have a choice. You can match their volume, or you can hold your ground. You can show them, as Chen did, that virtue isn't measured by how loudly you speak, but by the truth you carry in your silence. And that, more than any one exchange, is what turned his words into history. And so, the clip that America can't stop replaying, the moment Judge Edward Chen shut down Pam Bondi with one savage line, was never just about a clash of personalities. It was about the clash of values. On one side, arrogance, noise, and performance. On the other, dignity, patience, and truth. The reason people keep coming back to that line isn't because it embarrassed Bondi. It's because it reminded us of something we've been starving to see, that calm integrity still has the power to silence arrogance. That justice doesn't need theatrics to win, it just needs courage. Think about it. In an age where politics often feels like a circus, where voices compete to be the loudest, Chen reminded us that the strongest voice is the one that carries principle. His silence was strategy, his restraint was strength, and when he finally spoke, the entire country leaned in, not because he demanded attention, but because he had earned it. That's the lesson, and that's why this story matters. Not because Bondi was left speechless, but because millions of people finally felt seen, heard, and validated by a single sentence. And now, the question is, what do we do with that energy? If you believe that dignity beats arrogance, if you believe that justice should never be drowned out by noise, if you believe that America is strongest when truth speaks calmly but firmly, then don't let this story stop here. Share it. Talk about it. Carry it into your own conversations. And if you want more stories that lift up dignity, resilience, and truth in the face of arrogance, hit subscribe. Join this movement. Because your voice matters, and together, we can prove that principle still has power.